Hare Krishna. Welcome to the Migratory Monk channel. Continuous alien rule in India for over a millennium has resulted in implanting in Indian histories numerous blundering notions as sacrosanct concept. Those myths nurtured under government recognition and patronage for many centuries have now acquired a stamp of authority through sheer passage of time. If by history we mean a factually and chronologically accurate account of a country's past, current Indian histories deserve to be classed with Arabian Nights. Such history must be repudiated and rewritten. In this channel, I have indicated a few blunders of Indian historical research. They are just a sampling of the vast scope for research that awaits scholars who are prepared to take a second look at Indian and world history and do some fresh thinking uninhibited by previous tutoring. Like a virus infection, the blunders of Indian historical research have affected other spheres too. For instance, students of architecture and civil engineering are taught to believe that medieval monuments in India and West Asia are products of Saracenic architecture, while in fact the Indo-Saracenic architecture theory is a biggest myth. All medieval monuments are pre-Muslim Rajput monuments falsely credited to alien Muslim rulers. Likewise, it was Indian architects and craftsmen who designed and built West Asian monuments since they were driven across Indian borders at sword point to build such monuments in the native lands of the invaders. Among the many weak links in the so-called Indo-Saracenic theory of architecture is the existence of Hindu patterns to the last details in all medieval monuments. This is tried to be explained away as a result of the preference of the Hindu artist employed. There are many flaws in these arguments. Firstly, chauvinistic Muslim accounts have never credited Hindu artists with designing their monuments. For example, in the case of the famous Taj Mahal, they ascribe its design to some mysterious Isa Effendi. Secondly, even if they credit any design to a Hindu in those days of medieval cruelty and fanaticism, they would never have tolerated any Hindu artist weaving infidel designs into the pattern of a Muslim mosque or tomb. So even this argument falls to the ground. The other facetious assertion is that the master architect used to lay down the broad outline of the design, leaving it to the individual workmen to fill in the details according to their individual whims and fancies. The hollowness of this argument becomes apparent on a little reflection. Unless the entire contemplated design has been laid down at the very start, it would be impossible to order the required material of the kind and in the quantity desired. If individual workmen were left to work out their own fancied designs, they would all work to cross purposes and no longer remain amenable to the control of their supervisors, since they would keep dodging and delaying, shrinking and thwarting the project on the plea of lack of time or inspiration in fulfilling their part of the task. So, the argument that Hindu patterns adorn Muslim monuments because Hindu workmen were allowed a free hand is thus palpably absurd, examined from any angle. This has been amply illustrated by many authentic history books, proving that the Taj Mahal was not constructed by Shah Jahan, it was not Akbar who commissioned Fatehpur Sikri, and that the Red Fort in Agra was not built by him either. Almost every medieval historic building, bridge or canal has been falsely attributed to alien Muslims, though in fact it was constructed centuries earlier by Bharat's own Hindu rulers. The basic cause of all this misrepresentation and falsification has been Bharat's 1235-year-long slavery during which alien rulers played havoc with Bharat's archaeology. Prior to the founding of British rule in India in the 19th century, there was no archaeology department as such in the long alien Muslim rule that preceded British rule in India. It was one long story of grab and misappropriate Hindu buildings to be treated as mosques and tombs. So, when the British came to power in Bharat, all historic buildings long converted into tombs and mosques were under occupation and possession of nondescript Muslims. When the British first set up an archaeology department for Bharat, they unwittingly consulted these Muslims on the spot and recorded their bluffs. Such bluffs have since formed the nucleus of the prestigious archaeological department of the Government of India. The Muslims in possession or occupation of those buildings were not interested in divulging the real pre-Muslim origin or ownership of the buildings, for fear that if they admitted or divulged the Hindu origin of the building, they would lose the right to be in possession or occupation. A certain fanatic Islamic chauvinism also prevented them from crediting those captured or usurped buildings to their earlier Hindu owners. It could also be that those Muslims on the spot were so uneducated and ignorant that they themselves did not know that those buildings had any earlier pre-Muslim history. Another possibility is that a repetitious assertion that a certain building was somebody's tomb or mosque automatically lead to the myth that it was originally built for that purpose. What in fact they should have meant and what British archaeological officials should have realized was that those buildings were put to use as tombs and mosques after capture from the Hindus. Thus, for instance, what the visitor sees as an Akbar's subterfuge or Humayun's tomb may only signify that those personages are buried there, if at all. But to imagine that the huge palatial buildings were erected to mark their burial spots is a gross historical and archaeological blunder or crime. Those buildings existed much earlier. The alien Muslim conquerors lived in those captured buildings and were perhaps buried there. Even their burial in those massive, majestic buildings is also doubtful. It could be that all or many of those graves inside those massive captured Hindu buildings are all fake and are meant to retain possession of the buildings for Islam without even appointing a watchman. I might cite here a few instances of how this great archaeological falsification was achieved. Soon after the British government in Bharat began setting up the archaeological department, they found most of the historic buildings in Muslim occupation and possession. Those Muslims nursing nostalgic memories of their tattered empire were eager to at least have all buildings attributed to erstwhile Muslim rulers. In that unseemly hurry to identify everything in the name of bygone Muslim rulers, courtiers and fakirs, they paid no regard to truth, as is the traditional character of a Muslim. Vincent Smith, in his book Akbar the Great Mughal, therefore rightly complains that the site in Sindh province near Amarkot fort, marked with an archaeological board as Akbar's birthplace, is not the real spot. Likewise, some Hindu ruins in Kalanur in the Punjab, where Akbar as a lad of 13 was camping when the news of the death of his father, Emperor Humayun, was conveyed to him, have been identified by the archaeology department as the place where young Akbar was formally proclaimed king. We have no quarrel with that, but Muslim chronicles of a later date and archaeological records claim something more. They seem to assert that Akbar was crowned in a building of Mughal construction existing at the spot, and that the ruins seen there are the ruins of those Mughal buildings. This is a gross falsehood and misconception. How could Akbar, a mere stripling, have constructed any huge massive building there? His father too could not have constructed any building there, since he had returned to India only 6 months earlier after a 15-year exile forced by another Muslim demon, Sher Shah. So if Akbar was crowned king at the designated spot in Kalanur, it only means he was at the time camping in an earlier Hindu mansion, either fully or partly ruinous from repeated Muslim invasions. This correction in our archaeological records of that spot in Kalanur is essential. A third graphic instance of how fictitious archaeological identification has been done in India relates to Muhammad Gawan's grave in Bidar. Muhammad Gawan was a wanderer and adventurer who drafted to Bharat in the 14th century from West Asian Muslim countries. He rose for a short, uncertain duration to be the wazir of a Bahmani sultan. His fall, too, was equally precipitous. He was murdered at the orders of the very sultan whose chief minister Muhammad Gawan was. Usually, a person who fell foul of the reigning sultan never got a regular burial. The victim's body usually got dismembered and thrown to dogs and vultures. This was also obvious from the fact that until 1945 his grave had not been identified. Then suddenly some chauvinistic Muslim archaeology official got busy, went to Bidar and marked one of the many nondescript roadside graves in that city as that of the Muhammad Gawans. Ever since, researchers feel willy-nilly coerced into referring to that grave as Muhammad Gawan's because it now bears a government stamp and recognition. But researchers must not blindly accept such archaeological fiats. They must question and reinvestigate the identity of every historical site, since chauvinists in unseemly haste, misusing governmental power and position, have done violence to truth. There could possibly be two motives. One, as government servants, they may have wanted to go on record as diligent bureaucrats who did some identification. And number two, sometimes as Muslims, they also derived the chauvinistic delight or perpetuating the memories of a vanished past. Here I am giving you another example. 35 or 40 years ago, an archaeology official of Madhya Pradesh region took into his head that he must identify the grave of Abul Fazl, a self-styled chronicler and courtier of the third generation Mughal Emperor Akbar. History records that Abul Fazl was ambushed and slain 10 to 12 miles from Narwar, somewhere near a place called Sarai Barar, on August 12, 1602 AD. Starting with such flimsy, uncertain and hearsay data, the official went to the indicated region. There he saw a number of graves littered over a wide area. By a bureaucratic hunch, he chose one cluster of graves amongst them and assumed that one must belong to Abul Fazl and a few attendants who may have fallen victims in the ambush along with Abul Fazl. The next question was how to identify Abul Fazl's grave amongst those 4 or 5. It appeared very simple. One of the 4 or 5 graves was a few inches taller than the rest. That was enough and more for the archaeology official. It was promptly identified as the most sacred burial site of the august courtier of the great Mia Akbar. It was so recorded in archaeological registers. Some amount was sanctioned to build a room around it and perhaps to pay for a permanent watchman. Ever since, honorary students of history and archaeology have felt compelled to accord academic recognition to that spot as the site of Abul Fazl's murder. The archaeology official should have known that he was embarking on an impossible task. Moreover, the uncertainty about Abul Fazl's grave should have raised some other pertinent questions in his mind. In 1602 AD, Akbar was at height of his power. At the time of his murder, Abul Fazl was a great court favorite and was boasted was one of the 9 gems of Akbar's court? If this is true, why did not Akbar himself take care to identify Abul Fazl's grave? In fact, how is it that Akbar did not care to construct a magnificent palatial tomb for his favorite courtier, since Muslim rulers and courtiers have been termed as builders of mosques and tombs? Galore. Such little questioning should be enough to make it clear to students of history that Muslims never constructed lofty tombs for the dead and that Abul Fazl was a mere hanger-on at court for whom Akbar could not simply care. When Akbar himself did not care or was unable to identify Abul Fazl's grave, how could any archaeology official 450 years later hope to identify Abul Fazl's grave from amongst hundreds in a nondescript region without any specific data? These instances should suffice to convince officials and students of archaeology and history not to place too much faith in archaeological identification of medieval sites. Various motives, political motives, have led to fictitious identification. All archaeological records to be carefully revised, rechecked and revamped. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe it. Hare Krishna, Har Har Mahadev.